Hello everyone, and today I could not be more excited to talk to you about a book series that I just finished up reading, and that is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. It's comprised of 4 books, Shadow in Summer and A Betrayal in Winter, which are contained in this bind-up, and then the last 2, which is An Autumn War and The Price of Spring, which are contained in this second volume as well. These 4 are The Long Price Quartet, which is the inaugural work, one could say, from Daniel Abraham. This is a series that, as I was reading it, I had an epiphany. I had a realization. I had 2. One was that this series corrects something that most big epic fantasy series get very badly wrong. They do poorly. And the second realization was about halfway through that I was reading a series that, at least as of now, is going to be a top 10 fantasy series of all time for me. So I'd like to talk about all of those things a little bit more here in this video. The Long Price Quartet is Daniel Abraham's first published work, as far as I understand it. He's better known for his science fiction work, done under the pen name James S.A. Corey, and then he's also written some urban fantasy novels that are written under another pen name that I can't remember, so we'll just throw up the cover here with the pen name. But when he writes traditional epic fantasy, he writes under his own name, Daniel Abraham. So he wrote Long Price Quartet, and then a more standard epic fantasy series called The Dagger and the Coin, which I could not be more excited to get to now, having finished this. And he is currently in the process of releasing a new fantasy trilogy called the Kithamar Trilogy. So what is the Long Price Quartet about? So most people who know about this series, at least in our corner of BookTube, heard about it because of Alan from the Library of Alexandria really hyping it up, saying it was a favorite series of his, just really shouting from the rooftops, being a prophet for the series about how excellent and criminally overlooked it was. And that's how I first heard about it as well. I actually read the first book, A Shadow in Summer, a couple of years ago, and it was at a bad time in life, and so I wasn't terribly impressed and didn't continue. But boy, am I glad that I finally picked these books up again. The Long Price Quartet follows primarily 2 main characters, named Ota and Mati. At the beginning of A Shadow in Summer, in the prologue, we meet both of them when they are preteens, and they are attending what is essentially this world's version of wizard school. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But the rest of the book, A Shadow in Summer, takes place when they're a little bit older. Ota's in his 20s, Mati is an older teenager. But the decisions, very even seemingly small decisions, that were made back in poet school have shaped them and have impacted the course of life that they decided to go. The decisions made in this prologue have shaped Ota and Mati. And so in A Shadow in Summer, the course that the plot takes in that very first book is determined by that prologue. And then the course that the rest of the series takes really is all formed by what happens in this first novel. The second book takes place about 15 years later, and so on as the novels go on. So in the second book, they're in their 20s and 30s. In the next one, 30s and 40s, 50s and 60s, and so on. And so by the end of the series, we're following Ota and Mati as they are older men, much older, by the time we get to the last book in the series. So this is really different. A lot of traditional fantasy, you kind of have a one linear story that takes place and the sequel picks up right where the next book left off, or at least relatively soon. We don't have these massive consistent time jumps, so much so that each book in the Long Price Quartet is honestly its own self-contained story. In a way, the books rarely end on a cliffhanger, on a what's going to happen next, and the books also don't contain flashbacks. So we don't have long periods of time. Abraham doesn't cheat by showing you, here's what happened in the meantime. He catches you up to date really with just a few sentences on what happened to the characters. But this isn't really telling you what the story is about as much as the structure of the story, but that's important to understand too. In an age when most epic fantasy series are pitched as Game of Thrones meets this, I jokingly messaged Alan and said that this series is like a Game of Thrones meets Hamilton. So if you watch the musical Hamilton, you'll see that we meet Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr when they're very young men, at the beginning of Revolution, both single up-and-comers. And over the course of the musical, we see how their paths intertwine as they go from being friends to rivals to enemy, or to sort of allies to being enemies by the end of the musical. And there's a similar type of arc that we go on with Ota and Mati. Not that arc specifically between Burr and Hamilton, but a similar arc in the sense of we see just how much their friendship changes and evolves over many, many years. So to get a little bit more specific about what the plot is rather than just, oh, it's following these two people, we need to talk about the setting of this series. So the Long Price Quartet is primarily set in an Asian-inspired world in which the wizards of the world are basically called poets. And the primary form of magic that's used is the poets harness small gods, genies, demons, however you want to figure them in your own head, but they're called Ondat. And what an Ondat is it's a theoretical idea made into a physical manifestation. So let me clarify this a little bit more in case you haven't heard this pitch for it before. In the first book, the city where a poet, is what the wizards are called, a poet works with one of his Ondat, and they work in the cotton trade. And the Ondat, this genie creature, is called Seedwis. Well, his full name is called Removing the Part That Continues. And rather than harvesting cotton and needing to pluck all the seeds from it and then bundling it up, this Ondat can come in, snap his fingers, and literally have all the seeds drop out of the cotton. And it gives the city an edge up on that part of the trade because they have literally a supernatural power that can harness and can impact this element of trade that they have. So removing the part that continues. But also, this Ondat, this being, this genie, can also be used as a weapon. It can be used to remove, say, babies out of a mother's womb. So that could be used as a weapon, say, against its enemies. And a rival country to the Kayam, which is the Asian-inspired land that most of the books take place in, called Galt, sees this as a threat. They see the Kayam as being potentially dangerous, and so they frequently they're basically stuck in a sort of a Cold War, where the Galts are much more stronger in terms of their military, they have much more advanced technology, but they live in fear of the Kayam turning the Ondat on them. There's another Ondat called Stone Made Soft, where he can snap his fingers and turn mountains literally just into mud pies. And that also, you can think of how that could be used as a weapon. You could level cities with that. You could wipe out entire mountain ranges. It could be very dangerous if that was turned against a rival nation. And so the Galts and the Kayam are sort of stuck in this Cold War. And so in the first book, Shadow and Summer, the Galts have constructed this elaborate plot to try to get the poet of this city, who harnesses Seedwis, to get him to basically release Seedwis of his own free will. So they're trying to come up with a way to remove not only this potential super weapon that this city holds, but also remove the edge up that this city has on the cotton trade in the area. Okay, so a lot of this first book involves people who are figuring, and I should clarify, you learn that this is what the Galts are trying to do, you learn that this is what the plot that they're trying to enact is in like chapter 3, so very early on in the book. But the two main characters, Ota and Mati, end up playing critical roles in trying to discover the plot, in trying to maybe even stop it, in trying to figure out what all is going on, who all is in bed with the Galts. And very small decisions that were made in that prologue that I alluded to end up setting the course for where Ota and Mati's paths both converge and diverge in this first novel. The series is called The Long Price Quartet because we see very small actions and choices that are made in that first book playing out and having very large consequences over the course of the series. One other thing I wanted to mention is because of the long timeline of the series, in the first few books we see Ota and Mati as young men make very dumb decisions. And then, and you'll just sit there as the reader, like just smacking your head, being like, And then by the end of the series, Ota and Mati are old men. And we see the young men of the next generation making the same types of dumb decisions, screwing up in the same ways. And we also see that at different times where maybe Ota or Mati did not learn their lesson earlier on, or they didn't learn their lesson when they were younger, that they continue to make those same mistakes. But at times when they did learn, now they're able to help guide the next generation coming. So we'll talk about this a bit more, but that your actions don't just affect you, they affect everyone around you. And so we definitely see that in a very real way with these two main characters. One other thing to note here is, I said each novel is almost a self-contained story. Books 1 and 2 are probably more of an arc, and then books 3 and 4 are more of an arc. I'd recommend reading the series straight through without a whole bunch of big breaks, but if you do have to take a break, do it in between book 2 and 3. And then the last thing that I forgot to mention here that's worth pointing out is that basically each book has 50% new cast. There is some carryover between some significant characters, but you'll learn new characters in different times, at different times in these guys' lives, which is a cool element, I thought, in this series as well. But I'd like to talk about some of the things that Daniel Abraham does very well in this series. And the first is his writing. So Abraham was somebody who got mentored by George Martin, was sort of, you could call him an apprentice in a certain way. And you can definitely see a certain amount of influence there in terms of Abraham has a similar amount of skill that George Martin does. Abraham writes characters in a much more, I think, realistic way than Martin does, in the sense of you read Abraham's characters and they're very human. You feel like they're people that you've encountered or that you've met. Whereas George Martin's characters are very sensational, very over the top. You know, it's not just like, oh, he's a knight and a child murderer, but he's sleeping with his sister. And there's nothing like that in Long Price Quartet. It's like, you know, the wizard who's dealing with a midlife crisis and depression and a drinking problem. It's like, oh yeah, no, I've known guys who are like that. So his character work is excellent, but so is his writing. It's not overly flowery. It's not like it'll stand out of like, oh my goodness, these $10 words that he's using. But he's able to, in a few sentences, give a very clear picture of who a character is, what makes them tick, how they process life, their worldview, how that's distinctly different from the characters around you, or from the characters around them. And George Martin does a similar thing, and I think Abraham does it as good as Martin does in these books, which I really appreciated. Another thing that I really liked about these books is that the whole thing is set up almost like a stage play, in the sense that you see people and you see their courses that are set by the decisions that they made, that they are locked into a certain path, that they are unable to deviate from that path because of choices that they made earlier on. And it almost gives the impression of watching actors play out a play that's been preset for them, where the lines have been pre-recorded. The ending is inevitable because of the lines that have been written. So there's a certain sense there, but it also feels like a play because most of these books are character-driven and dialogue-driven, not action-driven. There's like 1, maybe 2 action scenes in this entire quartet, and yet it never felt boring. It never felt like we're losing momentum. Now, if you need something exploding or you need somebody being chased every other chapter, well, yeah, this series definitely isn't that. But it really shook me about halfway into book 3. I'm like, I am the majority of the way through this series, and Daniel Abraham has not wasted a single chapter. Every single chapter has done something to move the plot forward, to develop a character, to set something up, to pay something off. Every single chapter has been deliberate. There has been no wasted space in the course of these novels. And that is definitely true, and something that cannot be said for a lot of epic fantasy series. So this is where I think Long Price Quartet excels, where a lot of other epic fantasy series maybe don't. So if you look at these, if you put the two bind-ups together, you can see that, it's not like this is short. It's not like you'd read this in an afternoon. But this entire quartet is shorter than most of the Stormlight archive books that Sanderson writes. Daniel Abraham puts more story into these 4 short books than most fantasy authors would have in epic 5-book series. More world-changing events happen in these 4 short books than happened in, say, the 6 Wheel of Time books that I read before I tapped out of that series. For me, that's remarkable. I as I've read more and as I've consumed more, especially in the epic fantasy genre, have started to lose my patience more and more with authors who just spin their wheels, where I feel like things are getting repetitive, like we're not going anywhere, like we're just making this big for the sake of feeling epic or for it feeling large, or like a lot of time has passed. And Abraham shows that you can do all of that without wasting the time of the reader, which I really, really appreciated. One of the things that I also really appreciated about this is what I think is one of the basic themes that underlines the Long Price Quartet, which is similar to a theme that Dostoevsky plays with in Crime and Punishment, which is that you really, over the course of your life, you really never get away with anything. You might not see the ramifications, you might not see the effects of it in a year, in 2 years, but nobody ever really gets away with anything. If you try to bend the rules of reality, of morality, if you try to just redefine that because it's more convenient to you, or because you don't feel like the rules apply to you, reality and morality will snap back somewhere else. You're not just going to get away with it, even if you think you have because of the short-term consequences. And you see that happening, playing out in real time in front of you over the course of these characters' very long lives. Like I said, small decisions, small mistakes that are made very early on in the first book have massive implications later on in the series. And that's why it's called the Long Price Quartet. But one of the other reasons why it's called the Long Price Quartet is because there's a price that comes from these poets, from these wizards, harnessing these small gods, these demons, these Ondat. If they, and the way that they harness them, the grammar, the magic they use is never clearly defined. It's just a function within the story. But if they try to harness one of these and it goes badly, the poets suffer some horrible death relating to the Ondat, to the idea that they were trying to harness. So there's one Ondat that's called, I believe, Water Running Down, and a poet who tried to harness it and it went badly ended up like having their belly like explode with like seawater gushing out of it. So pretty gross death resulting from the idea that they were trying to harness and failed. So there is a price to harnessing these things, and if you fail, you have to pay the price. So once again, it ties into this idea of there being consequences to your actions. You don't just get away with stuff. In a similar way, if you harness one of the Ondat and succeed, the Ondat, it is just built into them, are always trying to escape. And so there's a certain watchfulness and a certain amount of alertness that you need to have all the time if you're one of the poets, if you're one of the wizards who have harnessed one of these. Because not only is the Ondat a manifestation of this theoretical idea of stone made soft, of water running down, but also because you're the poet and you're the one binding it, part of the Ondat comes from out of you as well. Part of it is a reflection of the poet itself. So in the example of Seedless, in the example of removing the part that continues, the poet that bound him, Heshai, deals with a crippling amount of self-loathing. And so that self-loathing is reflected in the Ondat as well. So Seedless has a strong amount of loathing and distaste for the poet that bound him because it's a reflection of that poet's soul. So there's a certain amount of cost and weight that those poets have from even a successful binding, not just a failed one. So this question of paying a cost for what you do is one that is reflected even in the fantasy elements that are used here. And I guess that's worth pointing out. Besides the Ondat, there really isn't much fantasy here. There isn't a lot of magic, other creatures, anything like that. So this is very much political fantasy. I would say some people would call it epic fantasy, but you're not going to get a dozen races that you need to keep track of. Personally, I found this very digestible, very easy to go through over audiobooks. So if you're somebody who likes audio, I thought they were excellent and well worth the listen. One other point that it showed is that you're not an island. The decisions that you make, the decisions that Ota and Mati make, they might think are, well, if I have to pay the price for it, well, that is what it is, and I'll pay that maybe years later. Maybe reality will snap back and punish me eventually farther on down the line. But what they don't realize, and this is just a truth of life. This isn't even a spoiler for the story. This is just how the world works, is that no man is an island. And the decisions that you make don't just, the long price that you have to pay for it doesn't just affect you, but it affects the people around you. Your friends, your enemies, your loved ones, your family, what have you. And that I found very sobering. So books, there's a lot of books that I read, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, that are interesting, that are fun, that are entertaining, that are engaging, that I read, I close the book and I say, book good, I like a book, and I put back on the shelf, and after 2 months, I could tell you that I read it, but it doesn't have any type of lasting impact on me. But the books that really, really stick with me, whether that's the Book of the New Sun, whether that's A Song of Ice and Fire, the books that really, Tolkien's work, sit with me, are books that I'm not just thinking about them for a long time afterwards, but they are books that, because of the story, are not just making me think about the story, but making me think about my own life in a very different way because of that story. And Long Price Quartet did that for me in spades. Because I'm, at least as of the time of recording this, I'm still a younger guy. There's still a lot of decisions that I'm making that are still in the time of life for Ota and Mati that are within that first book. And I'm seeing the way that things that they brushed over, that they thought, oh, it's no big deal. Oh, this isn't so bad. Oh, a little compromise here. Who's really going to care? What does it really matter? And it ended up mattering, not just for them, but for everybody around them, decades later on down the road. Now, am I a fantasy wizard? Am I a fantasy prince? No, I am not, in fact. But the same principle of life is true, both in the Long Price Quartet and in real life. And it's made me think a lot about my decisions, about the way I'm spending my time. And if a book can make me think about it as much as these have, well, that's what makes it an all-timer. So anyway, guys, I don't have a whole lot else to say in a non-spoiler fashion about the Long Price Quartet, other than to say you should absolutely read this. You should give this a try. Some people find the first book to be slow. When I read it for the first time, I was not overly impressed. When I read it the second time, I absolutely loved it. So if you don't love the first book, I would say keep reading. Keep reading on to the second book. The third book is my favorite in the series. The third book is one of the most remarkable, incredible, unique, different fantasy novels that I have ever read. And remember, guys, if you've pushed through any of the Stormlight books, if you've pushed through one of the later A Song of Ice and Fire or Wheel of Time books, you've read individual novels that are longer than this entire quartet put together. And yet, this quartet, as short as it is, packs quite a punch. So if you can push, even if you don't love entirely the first novel, even if you just like it, or you're interested by it, it is absolutely worth pushing through. Now, the people who don't like the first novel or who it doesn't completely work with them are probably the ones who are more looking for action, who are more looking for a more bombastic story than what Abraham is putting forward here. And that's fine. Different strokes for different folks. But if you want something that's going to really make you think, that has really good political intrigue as part of the story, that has plots within plots, that has some excellent, fantastic character work, then you should be reading The Long Price Quartet. So thank you to Alan for recommending this so highly, and who has not ceased banging the drum about this series. And I'll also briefly say thanks to John Minton from Talking Story and Josh from Red Fury Books. They've been reading the series this summer, and hearing them talk about it again made me go, I want to check out that series again. And I've discovered, or rediscovered, depending on how you look at it, a new favorite. So thank you to everyone for watching this video. This one, to me at least, felt a little bit more disjointed and rambly than some of my usual stuff, but I don't really care, because I felt like it was important to share how much these books have meant to me. In terms of series that I've read and completed this year, even over the Alchemy Wars books, even over the Book of the Long Sun, I don't know, this might be my favorite series that I've read this year. If it's not my favorite, it's in the top 3. So you guys should absolutely go check it out. Thank you all for watching this video today. Take care.